So if you're just now joining us, we are actually in week 3 of a series called Moving Forward. And what we've been talking about in this series is that all of us in our lives, we all have an area of our lives. For most of us, we have several areas of our lives where we want to move forward, where we feel like we're kind of stuck, and we don't know how to get from where we are to where we want to go. Now, what we've been saying in this series is that even though we're talking about how to get from where you are to where you want to go, in all truthfulness, the series is really about following. Because for us as Christians, we are followers of Jesus, right? I mean, that's what it means to be a Christian. We call ourselves followers of Jesus. And so if we're supposed to follow Jesus, then moving forward actually means following. And what we said in week 1, so this is week 3, what we said in week 1 is you can't follow from the front. And the mistake that a lot of us make is we try to move out in front, like we saw Peter do in week 1, where Peter kind of made some assumptions about what Jesus wanted, about what his will was, about what Jesus had been talking about. And those assumptions were based on some cultural understandings that he had in his upbringing, and based on his own presuppositions, he made some assumptions, and because he made those assumptions, he got out in front of Jesus. And the problem with that is you can't follow from the front. And we know that we're supposed to be followers of Jesus, and yet most of us, we want Jesus, we say we want Jesus to be in control, we say Jesus is the Lord of our lives, but the reality is we still want to make the decisions. We want him to drive, but we want to tell him where to turn. And the problem is you can't follow from the front. And what we also said week 1 is the reality is it's in your best interest to follow. It's in your best interest to be behind rather than in front, because Jesus knows what he's doing. He knows where he's going. He sees what you can't see. He knows what you don't know. And so when we get out in front, we lead to mistakes that we wouldn't have otherwise made if we were following. And those mistakes usually leave a mess. And so what we left week 1 was saying that when moving in front leads to mistakes that leave a mess. Scars, regrets, and wasted time. Now, what we said last week is that some of us have the opposite problem. It's not that we get out in front of Jesus. For us, the problem is that we lag behind. Jesus has moved on ahead, and we're not following. We're lagging behind. And the reason that we lag behind, for most of us, is because of fear. Fear will keep you from following, and that's what we talked about last week. And the problem that many of us make in following Jesus is that what we think is that eventually the fear will go away. If I wait long enough, if I pray long enough, if I read my Bible more, if I go to church more, whatever it is, we think that if we do enough of something that eventually the fear will go away. But the problem with that is that the passing of time does not decrease fear. Usually it increases fear. The longer that you wait, the more that you begin to fear. And that's not just in your spiritual life, that's just typical in everyday life, in every area of life. If you're afraid of something, the longer you delay, the longer you pause, the more that fear tends to grow. And so if we're going to follow Jesus in the face of fear, then how do we do that? Because the fear isn't going to go away. So how do we move forward even when we're afraid? And what we said last week is that it's about focus. And we looked at the story of Peter walking on the water, and as long as his focus was on Jesus, Peter walked on the water. And then it says that when he saw the wind. Do you remember that? When he saw the wind, he began to sink. And what we said last week is that you can't see the wind. Peter wasn't actually seeing the wind, and I love that phrase because what it means is that what he was looking at was not really there, right? He was afraid of what he couldn't even see. And what a picture that is for our own lives, because sometimes our fears are so unfounded, and we worry about things that will never happen. In fact, we saw last week statistically 70% of what you worry about will never happen. And we're focusing on the wind. And so how do we overcome our fear? Well, it becomes about focus. When Peter focused on Jesus, then he was able to move forward. But when he took his focus off of Jesus and moved his focus to his fears, that's when he began to fall. And so when you focus on your fears, you will fall. But when you focus on Jesus, you will follow. And the point I left you with last week is that faith wavers when focus wanders. Faith wavers when focus wanders. When your focus wanders off of Jesus, that's when your faith begins to fail you and your fear begins to take over. Now, what I want us to do this week is to talk a little bit more about faith? How do we grow it? How can we be strong enough to follow through the tough times? Do any of you have someone that you would consider like a hero of the faith, one of your heroes of the faith? Just raise your hand if there's anybody in your life that you consider a hero of the faith. No one? Yeah, that's what I thought. Most of us do. Most of us have big heroes of the faith, maybe somebody that you know, maybe somebody that you don't know, just somebody that you've heard of. Well, I have several in my life, and one of my heroes of the faith is Pastor Godfrey Wanamitsa, who's our director here at Arise Africa and started Arise Africa. And when I first met him, I was 19 years old, and I had was living in his home for almost 4 months. And while I was here, the dude worked me to death. I'm not even exaggerating. I preached 4 times a day, 5 days a week. I had Saturday off, but then it wasn't really off because I had to plan and prepare for Sunday, because on Sundays we were in at least 2 churches, so I was preaching twice on Sunday, sometimes even more, and then we would begin again all over again on Monday. And so I did this for months. And so Saturday was like my only haven, like it was my only time to catch my breath, and Nile Resort had just opened. This was 2001. Nile Resort had just opened, and so on Saturdays we would go and we would sit by the pool, and I would study and pray and read and prepare for the next week and for Sunday. And so while we were here, I'm preaching every day, I'm exhausted, and every Saturday Pastor Godfrey would tell me he wanted to take me to this place in Mayuge called Bukaleba. And what I knew about Mayuge is that there's nothing there in Mayuge, anywhere. And that Bukaleba was somewhere in the village, and I had no desire whatsoever to spend my Saturday doing that. I didn't want to. Saturday was my one day off. I don't want to go into the village. I want to be left alone. I want to relax. I want to swim and just be left alone. And so every Saturday he would say, you guys, I want to go and show you this place. I want to go and show you this place. And every Saturday we'd be like, no, please, can we just rest? And so after several months, my brother was here with me. My brother and I, we began to feel bad about it. And so we said, okay, fine, let's go this Saturday. And so this Saturday, after working ourselves to the bone, we got up early on Saturday and we drove all the way out to Mayuge. Then we branched off into the village, and in those days, going out that way, the roads were almost non-existent. And we went from roads which were almost non-existent to roads which were literally non-existent. There were no more roads. And Pastor Godfrey at the time had one of those Corolla wagons, like the ones with the longer ones. Front-wheel drive, not four-wheel drive, and we're literally driving up a hill where there is no road. And I'm not exaggerating when I tell you, the weeds were higher than the vehicle. You couldn't see. I have no idea how he even knew where he was going, because you literally couldn't see ahead. And I'm frustrated and angry the whole way out there. Oh my God, we're gonna get stuck out here. I just want to go back, and I want to relax and be left alone, and this is a nightmare. And sure enough, eventually he's just driving through this field, driving through the bush, which you can't see, and soon enough, the car comes to land on top of an anthill. He was going fast enough to get the car in the middle of the anthill, but not fast enough to go all the way over. And so we get out of the car and we look, and sure enough, the car is teeter-tottering like this on top of the anthill. And now I'm angry, I'm frustrated. My brother and I had to get on the front of the car. Pastor Godfrey put it in reverse, and my brother and I are bouncing on the front of the car, trying to get those front wheels to get some traction so that we can get off the anthill. After over an hour, it took us about an hour to get off the stupid anthill. After we got off, then we kept going rather than turning around and going back, which is what I wanted to do. And we get to the top of the hill somewhere in this place called Bukaleba. We get out of the car, and it's beautiful. You can see, Lake Victoria spreads like just before you, from as far as you can see right to as far as you can see left. And Pastor Godfrey looked at me and he said, God's going to give us the title to this land. Not we're going to buy it, God's going to give it to us. God's going to give us the title to this land. And when we get it, we're going to build a baby's home. and we're going to build a primary school and a secondary school and a hospital and a pastor's training center. He goes on and on and on and on and on. And I'm caught in the awe of this moment. And I wish I could tell you that I was like, man, this is amazing. But literally what went through my head is, there's no chance in hell any of this is ever going to happen. It's not going to happen. And here's why. When I knew Pastor God, this was the first time I had met him, and I'm staying in his home, he couldn't afford to keep the electricity on. He couldn't afford. We still had our offices here. The guest house did not yet exist, but our offices were here. He couldn't afford to keep the electricity on in the guest house or in his personal home. He couldn't afford to pay the phone bill. I went with him. He's a smooth talker, and I went with him multiple times down to the power company where he would literally sweet talk someone into switching the power back on, even though he gave them no money. And so here I am. I'm thinking, this guy has no money. He has no resources. He has no partners, and yet he's telling me he's going to do all of this stuff. And I thought, there's no way any of this is ever going to happen. And then here we stand so many years later, and the land belongs to Arise Africa. They didn't pay a dime for it. It was literally given to them by the government. And we have built a baby's home and a primary school and a secondary school. We have broken ground on a clinic which should be opening this year or next year. And there's actually even a guest house there, which he didn't mention in the original thing he told me, but there is a guest house there as well. And we have plans to begin a pastor's training center there in the coming years. Pastor Godfrey could see what I couldn't see. He had faith that I didn't have. And I've seen him live by faith over and over and over. And to me, he's a giant of the faith. And I aspire to be a man like him. I do. I aspire to be a man like him. Sometimes he frustrates me because he'll say things to me about, like when we've needed a car, and he'll tell me, Pastor Smooth, you need to buy your wife a car. And I'll say, Pastor Godfrey, I know I need to buy my wife a car. She was doing work in Bukaleba, and he would get frustrated because she couldn't do her work because she couldn't reach there because she didn't have a car, and I'm traveling everywhere else. And he would say to me, you need to buy your wife a car. I'm like, I know I need to buy my wife a car. I don't have money to buy a car. And he would say, no, don't talk to me about money. Let's just agree you're going to get your wife a car. I'm like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. How am I going to buy a car if I don't have money? And he would get so frustrated. No, don't talk to me about money. And then one day I finally agreed. My wife was frustrated. I was frustrated. Pastor Godfrey was frustrated. And finally I said, okay, fine, we're going to get her a car. The same day I wrote someone on Facebook. They had posted a car on Facebook for $5,000 here in town. And I wrote the guy and I said, I'm very interested in your car. I sent the message. And as soon as I sent the message, I thought, how stupid am I? How can I be very interested in this car? I literally don't have $1 to put toward the car. And the same day, someone gave me an envelope, somebody that I barely know, and I couldn't even tell you their name now. I don't know who they are. Somebody that I just kind of knew as an acquaintance at the time handed me an envelope for exactly $5,000, and they knew nothing about the car. The car was exactly $5,000 the very same day. I got handed an envelope for $5,000, and I wish I could tell you I was the one who had the faith in that kind of thing, but it's not me. It's Pastor Godfrey. And so I strive to be like him. I desire to be a man of faith like him. He's a man of faith, and I want to be like him. And most of us have somebody like that in our lives. They seem like giants of the faith. And sometimes guys like that, or women like that, people like that, we see them and they take what seems like these huge leaps of faith. And I look at people like that and I go, there's no way that I could ever have that kind of faith. I don't know how they are able to take those huge leaps, those huge jumps of faith. I mean, it just looks like these massive leaps of faith in my mind, and sometimes, honestly, it's even discouraging. Because I look at that and I go, I just don't know if I could ever have that much faith. And so, most of you, if you're honest, you felt that way before. You've seen people, you've admired people of faith, and you go, my faith, I just don't know how they do that. I don't know how they take those huge leaps of faith. And the real problem is that we've come to believe that following Jesus is about these huge leaps of faith. That's what it means to follow Jesus, to take huge leaps of faith. And so because we believe that it's following Jesus means taking these huge leaps of faith, so many of us stop following at all. And we once again kind of get left behind. And maybe that's you. Maybe you got saved and you wanted to follow Jesus. You started to follow Jesus, but eventually it became too difficult and it took too much faith, and you thought, no, I just can't live that life. I can't have that kind of faith. I can't take those kinds of leaps. That's just not going to work out for me. And at some point, for many of us, what happened is we decided to just be content with salvation and let that be that. I'm content with my salvation, but living this life that I see so many other people live, that's so far out of my reach, I'm just not even going to try anymore. Because following Jesus seems to be about these huge leaps of faith. Now, in the Gospels, there are so many stories that seem to indicate this very thing, that following Jesus is about these huge leaps of faith. We look at the disciples and we think about these things that they do that seem so big. Even when Jesus is calling his disciples, when Jesus finds someone and he walks up to them and he says, "Come, follow me," and they leave everything and they go and follow Jesus, the way that it seems in Scripture is these guys barely know Jesus, and yet they're able to leave the family business behind, leave their jobs behind, leave everything behind, and drop everything and follow Jesus. And sometimes, again, it's discouraging for me because I look at that and I go, I've been following Jesus since I was 12, and I still don't know if I have that kind of faith. And these guys have just met Jesus, and I don't know how does that happen? And when we read these accounts of Jesus calling his disciples, what most of us tend to think is that it's like a magic or a miracle. As a kid, I would read those passages, and to me, what I pictured in my head is like Jesus hypnotizing people, like, "Come and follow me." And people like zombies go and follow Jesus, right? Because nothing else makes sense to me in that moment. Now, let me just show you one example. Matthew chapter 4 and verse 18. As long as the machines keep working, it will be on screen, and you can follow along. Matthew chapter 4, verse 18 and 19. So just listen to this. Now, while walking by the Sea of Galilee. So the picture is Jesus is just walking by. When walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Now, what happens after he says that? It's not on the screen, but immediately they left their nets and they followed him. Immediately, they leave their nets and they follow him. And you get this picture that Jesus is just walking by. He sees two guys fishing, and he says, "Hey, follow me." And they just leave everything. They leave their father. They leave the family business, and they follow Jesus. Now, here's the problem with that perspective. The Gospels, what you may not realize is the Gospels contain summaries of stories, right? The Gospels don't give us all of the details of every event. And so sometimes we see an event like this and we process it wrongly. It looks like Jesus is just, Matthew even kind of says Jesus is walking by. But what he's doing, he's giving a summary, okay? And so it kind of gives us the impression, though, that he's just walking by. He says, "Follow me." These guys have never met Jesus before, never heard of Jesus before, don't know who he is, and they leave everything and they follow Jesus, which is this massive, massive leap of faith. But it actually doesn't work out quite that way. And thankfully for me, because it's helpful for my own faith to see this played out, Luke, in his gospel, he gives us a much more detailed account of what happens when Jesus called Peter and Andrew. And so what I want us to do right now is to turn to Luke chapter 5. Luke chapter 5 and verse 3. And we're going to read all the way down through verse 11, but we'll take it piece by piece. And what we're going to see, and we're not going to read these verses, but in the first verses 1 and 2, you see that Jesus wasn't just passing through, but that he had been preaching. And in fact, he would have been preaching for quite a long time. And as Jesus is preaching, people begin to press in. They're pushing in on him. And now as they're pushing in on Jesus, it becomes not only difficult for him to teach because people are pressing in on him, but difficult for everybody else to hear. So Jesus gets this idea, because he's on the shore there. He says, well, if I get in a boat and I push out from the shore, then people will no longer be able to press in on him, and also his voice will carry over the water. And so this is actually what's happening. He's not just passing through, he's actually preaching, and he decides to get out on this boat. Now, what do we see again in verses 1 and 2? Peter and his brother are washing and mending their nets. So we have a lot of fishermen here in Jinja, and maybe some of you know some fishermen, and they fish here much the same way that the disciples, these people would have been fishing in their day in the New Testament period, in the first century. And these nets would have taken a lot of time to wash and a lot of time to mend, hours. And so they would have been fishing all night long. You don't fish during the day. They fish all night long. They've come in the morning. Now Jesus is there preaching. Peter and Andrew were not there to hear Jesus. They were just there because they had come in from a long night of fishing and catching nothing, by the way. And they're washing and they're mending their nets. Now, as they're doing that, Jesus is teaching. And so what would have happened as they're mending their nets, they're listening to Jesus teach and preach. And most likely, and Luke doesn't give us all of these details, but most likely what happens here is they hear him and they begin to be intrigued by what he's saying. They become interested in who this guy is and what he's talking about. And so let's pick up the story in verse 3. Luke chapter 5 and verse 3. And it says this, getting into one of the boats, that's Jesus, getting into one of the boats, which was Simon's, that's Peter, remember? Getting into one of the boats, which was Simon's, he asked him to put out a little from the land. And he sat down and he taught the people from the boat. So here's Peter. I want you to get this. Here's Peter. He's been out all night long fishing. Now it's morning. He would have just finished his nets. Peter is ready to go home and go to bed. In fact, he would have been discouraged because he caught nothing. He has no fish to sell and no food to take home to his family. And so now Peter would have been tired and discouraged. And yet Jesus comes to him. He's been teaching for a while. Peter's been listening to this guy teach. And then Jesus approaches Peter and asks him to use his boat. Will you let me use your boat and push out from the land? People are pressing in on me and I need to teach. And Peter says yes. Now I want you to get this because this is important. This is a step for Peter. Okay, it's a step. It's a small step, but it's a step for Peter. What he wanted to do was to go home and sleep, to get some rest. But Jesus said, can I use your boat? And Peter has been listening. He's a little intrigued. He's a little interested. And he says, sure, why not? And Peter lets Jesus use his boat. And so let's continue verses 4 and 5. And when he finished speaking, he said to Simon, put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch. And Simon answered, Master, we toiled all night and took nothing. But at your word, I will let down the nets. Now, I want you to get the picture here. Because this is, remember, Peter's been fishing all night. They have just spent hours mending and washing their nets, and they're ready to pack it up and go home. Jesus asks to use the boat, and Peter agrees. And there may have even been a part of Peter that is thinking, I wish this guy would hurry up and finish so that I can go home and go to bed. And so he's in the boat. He said yes to Jesus. Now Jesus is going to take it another step. And he says to Peter, you know those nets that you just finished cleaning and mending all that time that it took? Yeah, I want you to undo everything that you've done and throw them back out in the water again. This would have been insanity to Peter. You don't fish during the day. You don't catch fish during the day. Even here in Uganda, our fishermen, they're out at night. You see them out there all night long throwing their nets and catching their fish. And this is what Peter would have been doing. And now Jesus, in the middle of the day, and probably the hottest part of the day at this point, he tells them to throw out their nets. And Peter argues with him a little bit and basically tells him that he's crazy. Like, we fished all night and we didn't catch anything. And now you want me to do it during the middle of the day? But because you've said it at your word, and he calls him master, which was a term of respect, and he says, because you've asked me to do it, and because at your word, I'm going to do it, and we'll throw out the nets. And this was another step. Another step. Jesus brought him one step, and then he asked him for another one. Another step. And Peter, again, agrees. Look what happens. Let's read verses 6 through 9. And when they had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were breaking. They signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. The boats have so much fish, they're beginning to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. So follow the process. Jesus is teaching, Peter is listening. He's not even there for Jesus, he's just there because he's got to clean and mend his nets. He hears Jesus preaching, he becomes a bit intrigued, a bit interested. Jesus asks him to take a step, and he does. Then Jesus asks him to take another step, which is a little bit bigger step. You've done all this work, and I want you to undo it, even though it doesn't make sense, because you don't fish during the day, and you didn't catch anything anyway all night, but I want you to do it anyway. And again, Peter says, yes, it's another step. Then when he takes that step, Jesus rewards his faith with this miracle, right? His faith is rewarded. His obedience is rewarded. Taking that step is rewarded, and he brings in this massive amount of fish. And when he does, Peter begins to realize for the first time that he's dealing with someone that he didn't even realize, like somebody bigger than he even realized. He doesn't even understand yet at this point that he's the Son of God, that he's the Messiah. He doesn't understand any of that yet. But he realizes in this moment, I'm in the presence of someone special. I'm in the presence of someone special. He works this miracle, and that miracle grows Peter's faith. And he realizes in that moment that he's dealing with someone that's more than simply a teacher. Step, another step. That step is rewarded. And then, that's when we get to this in verse 10. Verse 10. Also James and John, the sons of Zebedee, were partners with Simon, so they're together. And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you'll be catching men." And when they had brought their boats to the land, they left everything and they followed him. It's steps. It's a series of steps. Matthew gives us this summary. It's not wrong. It's not that they don't disagree with each other. They're not saying something different. Their goals are different. Matthew is giving us a very brief summary. Luke is giving us the details, and I'm so glad he did, because it helps me. Because I can look at this and see, okay, it wasn't like this kind of hypnotic thing or this massive leap of faith. It was still faith, okay? But there were steps. Take a step. Take another step. That step is rewarded. Peter realizes that Jesus is someone bigger. And then when he calls Peter to follow, his faith had been developed. His faith had grown through taking those steps. And that's when he's able to make the decision, yeah, I'm going to leave everything and I'm going to follow this guy. I don't know where this is going. I don't know what we're going to do. But this is obviously someone special, and I want to be with him. It's about steps. Not leaps. Steps. And what I would say is these people that are in your lives that are like these heroes of the faith in your eyes that you look at and you go, wow, that's such a huge leap of faith that they're taking. What I would say to you is they have been through the same process. What looks to you and me like some huge leap of faith, for them is actually just another step. They didn't jump from getting saved yesterday to having this massive amount of faith to leave everything and go do something that God called them to do tomorrow. It's step by step by step by step. And when we get this idea that following Jesus is always about these massive leaps of faith, the problem with that is so many times we get left behind because we don't have that kind of faith. And what I want to say to you this morning is that following Jesus isn't really about these massive leaps of faith. It's more about steps. And you see this played out time and time again in Scripture. And I've really just given you one example this morning. But Jesus just asked somebody to take a step. Not a leap, not a jump, just a step. And when you take that step, then he asks you to take another step. And then another step. And then another step. You see, following Jesus is about steps of faith, not leaps of faith. Following Jesus is about steps of faith, not leaps of faith. And we look at these heroes of the faith and we feel like, I can't be like them. I can't live like them. I can't trust like them. I don't have that kind of faith. And we feel like maybe God is disappointed with us and we just kind of give up and we decide, let me just be satisfied with salvation because I'll never live that kind of life. My last born, Kalia, is a year and a half. And you've seen her running around here, and she's walking and talking these days, and she's going through that phase where everything changes so quickly. Every day there are new words. But I still remember when she was just beginning to walk. I remember the very first step that she took. She took one step. Then she tried to take a second step. And she fell. Now, as her father, was I so disappointed in her when she fell? What kind of horrible father would I be? Like, really? You only got one step and then really? Come on, you got to do better than this. Pick up the pace. We got to get this thing done. No, she would take a step and we would cheer her on and we would, come on, you can do it. You know how it is, you parents or you have friends and family that have kids. We get so excited over the most simple things. Come on, you can do it. You can do it. Come on, take another one. And they take one step and then another step and another step. And in my house, we literally celebrated every step. Her sisters, myself, my wife, any of our staff, anybody in our home, every time she took a step, it's like an all-out celebration. Hands are in the air and people are celebrating. Ah, she took another step. Like we're celebrating every step. We're not disappointed when she falls. We celebrate every step. And we comforted her when she fell. We didn't condemn her. We didn't judge her. We didn't get angry with her or disappointed with her. We comforted her. Because she's a baby learning to walk. She didn't like take 3 steps one day, and then I enlisted her in the marathon that we just had the other week. I didn't enlist her in the marathon, right? I didn't go, well, you've been walking for 3 months now. It's long past time that you run a marathon, right? Noel is here. Noel, wave to everybody. Noel ran the marathon, right? Noel, how many years are you? He's 20 years old, okay? He's 20. Not a year and a half. I'm not expecting a year-and-a-half-year-old to run a marathon. You've been walking for quite some time. It's time for you to get out there and really run a marathon. No, that doesn't make sense. We don't treat infants that way. We don't treat school that way. We don't treat anything else in life that way. But for some reason, when it comes to our spiritual lives, we treat our spiritual lives that way. As if you just got saved, you've been walking with Jesus for a few months or a few years, and we act as if somebody like that ought to have faith, the same faith as someone that's been walking with Jesus for 20, 30, or 40 years. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And we feel like when we fail, when we fall, when we mess up, we try to take a step, but we fail. We feel like God's disappointed in us, God's angry or upset, and we know that's not the case in any other area of our lives. But in our spiritual lives, we treat it that way, and it just doesn't make sense. Following Jesus is about steps of faith, not leaps of faith. So the question is this. What step is he calling you to take right now? That's the question. What step is he calling you to take right now? Quit thinking about some big, huge thing. Like, it's good to have goals and you have to have a vision, but right now, what is he calling you to do? Yeah, maybe he's given you a picture of what the future looks like. Maybe he has, and you know that in your future there's this big thing. And maybe that big thing is so overwhelming you have no idea how you're going to get there. That's because maybe you're focusing on the wrong thing. What step is he calling you to take right now? And then take that step. And after you take that step, the question is, what is the next step? And what is the next step? Take one step and then another and then another. Stop looking at everyone else. Stop looking at people that have been following Jesus for longer than you've been alive. Stop looking at them. What step is he asking you to take right now? And take that step. Take that step. And then take the next step. You'll get there. That big stuff, that stuff that seems so far out of your reach, I promise you, you will get there, but not if you don't take the step that's right in front of you right now. You won't leap there from here. Following Jesus is not about leaps of faith. It's about steps of faith. You'll get there, but not if you don't start taking the small steps that are right in front of you right now. Let's pray together.